The evening was quiet, except for the steady sound of rain hitting the window panes. Laura Bennett sat in her living room, a half-finished cup of coffee beside her. Her husband, Richard, had called an hour ago saying he'd be late again. Lately, late again had become a routine sentence. She didn't question it anymore. Or at least she told herself she didn't. But deep down, there was a small, uneasy feeling that never went away. At 9:30, a soft knock broke through the silence. Wasn't loud or hurried. It was gentle, hesitant, almost afraid. Laura frowned. Few people visited at this hour, and the rain made it unlikely someone would stop by casually. She opened the door and found Melissa Carter standing there, her neighbor from down the street. Melissa was in her mid-30s, a few years younger than Laura, usually full of laughter and warmth. But tonight, she looked like she had been crying for hours. "Melissa, are you all right?" Laura asked, her concern genuine. Melissa's lips trembled as she nodded, though clearly she wasn't fine. "Laura, I'm sorry, I didn't know where else to go." Without another word, Laura stepped aside. "Come in." Melissa walked in slowly, her wet coat dripping on the floor, her hands clutching a small handbag, as if it were her only lifeline. Laura guided her to the couch and brought a towel from the hallway. Melissa took it with a quiet thank you. But her hands were shaking so much she could barely hold it. For a long minute, neither of them spoke. Laura watched her neighbor's trembling lips, the redness in her eyes. The way her shoulders slumped under invisible weight. Something terrible had happened. Laura could feel it. Finally, Melissa whispered, "It's about your husband." Those words froze the air around them. Laura felt her stomach tighten. She set her cup down, her fingers slightly trembling. "What do you mean, about my husband?" Melissa's eyes filled with tears again. "I don't want to hurt you," she said, "but I can't carry it anymore. Richard, he's been seeing me, coming over." For months. Laura blinked as if she hadn't heard correctly. The words didn't register immediately, but when they did, they hit her like a storm. She stared at Melissa, searching for a hint of a lie, a mistake, something to deny. But Melissa's tears were real. Her pain was real. "Why are you telling me this now?" Laura managed to ask, her voice soft, trembling. "Because I ended it tonight," Melissa said, barely audible. "He wanted to come over again, and I told him I couldn't do it anymore. I told him it was wrong, that I was tired of living with guilt. He got angry, said things I wish I could forget. I ran out before he could follow me. I came here because I didn't know where else to go." Laura's throat tightened. Her mind raced through months of strange behavior. The late meetings, the phone calls in the other room, the way Richard had become emotionally distant but overly kind afterward, like a man covering his tracks. She had ignored every sign because she didn't want to believe it. But now, hearing it from Melissa, it was undeniable. She stood silently for a while, her gaze fixed on the floor. Melissa cried quietly, whispering apologies over and over. "I didn't plan it, Laura. I swear. Started so small, friendly talks, a drink one evening when you were away. I should have stopped it before it began. But he kept coming back and I kept giving in. I hate myself for it." Laura wanted to be angry, to shout, to throw her out, to let her pain spill like the rain outside. But instead, she just sat beside her and said, "You should stay tonight." Melissa looked up, shocked. "What? You shouldn't go home in this weather. And you're clearly not okay. Stay here. You can use the guest room." Melissa hesitated. "You don't have to. I'm not doing it for you," Laura said calmly. "I just need time to think." Melissa nodded, too exhausted to argue. She followed Laura upstairs, and within minutes, the house fell into an eerie silence. Laura sat on her bed, staring at the faint reflection of herself in the mirror. Her face looked older, somehow tired, pale, distant. She picked up her phone, thought of calling Richard, then put it back down. There was nothing to say that could undo what she'd just heard. In the middle of the night, Laura heard soft sobs coming from the guest room. For a moment, she almost went in to comfort Melissa, not because she forgave her, but because she understood the loneliness that had led her there. It wasn't just about betrayal. It was about two women, both emotionally abandoned by the same man. The next morning, Richard's note was waiting on the counter. Gone to the office early. See you tonight. It was short and careless, the kind of note a man writes when he believes his secret is still safe. Laura folded it neatly and placed it beside her coffee cup, her mind oddly calm. Melissa came downstairs, her hair tied back, eyes swollen from crying. "I'll leave right after breakfast," she said quietly. "Stay," Laura replied without looking at her. "You don't have to rush." Melissa's expression softened with confusion. "You're being kinder than I deserve." "I'm not doing this out of kindness," Laura said. "I just think it's better to face the truth together, not apart." They sat across from each other at the kitchen table. The air was heavy, but no longer hostile. Laura asked questions when it started, how long it lasted, why Melissa finally stopped. Melissa answered everything honestly. The truth was painful, but it brought clarity. "I think I started falling for him," Melissa admitted quietly. "But I realized he wasn't in love with anyone. Not you, not me, not even himself. He just needed attention." Laura looked up from her cup. "You're right. It's always been that way. Charming when he wants something, distant when he gets it. Shared truth. That quiet understanding built an unexpected bridge between them." They weren't friends that morning, but they weren't enemies either. They were simply two women standing on the same broken ground. By afternoon, the rain had stopped. They stepped onto the porch with coffee mugs in hand. The sun peeked through the clouds, and for the first time in hours, Laura could breathe without feeling the weight of betrayal pressing on her chest. "You know," Melissa said softly, "you should hate me." Laura shook her head slowly. "Hate is easy. Understanding is harder." Melissa smiled faintly. "You're stronger than I thought." "Maybe I just got tired of pretending everything's fine." Laura replied. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway made both women turn. Richard's silver sedan gleamed under the weak sunlight. He stepped out, straightening his tie, looking as if nothing had changed. But when he saw both women standing together, something in his face shifted: confusion, guilt, maybe even fear. "Laura," he said, forcing a smile. "What's going on, Melissa?" Laura crossed her arms. "We were just talking about you." Richard blinked, his confident expression fading. "Talking about me? Why?" Melissa's voice shook, but she stood tall. "Because it's time you face what you did, Richard." He opened his mouth, but Laura interrupted. "Save it. We both know the truth now." Richard froze. His usual smooth tone failed him. For once, he looked small, cornered. The mask he'd worn for years began to slip. Laura didn't shout. She didn't cry. She simply looked him in the eye and said, "You broke something in both of us, and I'm not sure you even realize it." The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. Richard tried to speak, but Laura turned away, walking back into the house. Melissa followed her quietly, leaving him standing in the driveway. Drenched in disbelief inside, Laura closed the door and leaned against it, her hands trembling slightly. "That's enough for today," she whispered. Melissa nodded. "Will you do?" Laura looked out the window, watching Richard's reflection in the glass. "I don't know yet," she said. "But I know one thing, I'm done being the quiet one." Melissa reached out and gently touched her arm. "You don't have to go through this alone." Laura met her gaze. In that moment, she saw not the woman who had betrayed her, but someone who had suffered in the same way. Someone who, strangely, understood her better than anyone else. And though neither of them said it out loud, they both knew whatever came next, their story wasn't over. The next morning began with a silence that carried more weight than any argument could. Laura sat at the breakfast table, staring at the same cup of coffee she hadn't touched. The clock ticked loudly in the background, reminding her how slow time could feel when the truth finally surfaced. Upstairs, Melissa quietly packed her things, still unsure if she should stay or leave. Richard hadn't said a single word since the confrontation the evening before. He had slept in the guest room, or maybe he hadn't slept at all. When Laura heard him walking down the stairs, she didn't lift her head. She could feel his presence, the hesitation in his steps, the discomfort of guilt that hung heavy in the air. "Laura," he began softly. She finally looked up. "You don't need to explain anything," she said calmly. "I've heard enough." Richard ran a hand through his hair. "You think you know everything, but you don't. It wasn't what you think." She let out a faint, tired laugh. "So what was it then?" "A misunderstanding. A mistake that lasted months." He sighed. "I didn't plan for it to happen. Things at home were distant. You were busy. I was stressed." "Melissa was don't," Laura interrupted sharply. "Don't try to make excuses by blaming what I didn't do. You had choices, Richard. You always had choices." He fell silent. The weight of his own actions finally seemed to catch up with him. For the first time, Laura didn't see her husband. She saw a man who had been hiding behind excuses for years, from the stairs. Melissa's voice broke the tension. "Laura, I'll leave now." She had her bag over her shoulder, eyes lowered. "No," Laura said, standing. "Stay for breakfast. You might as well face this too." Melissa froze, surprised. Richard's face turned pale. "Laura, this isn't necessary." "It is," Laura replied, her tone steady. "We've all been pretending for too long. Let's stop now." The three of them sat at the same table, the same one where countless family breakfasts had once been shared with laughter and love. But now there was only silence and the soft sound of rain returning outside. After a long pause, Laura spoke first. "I don't need apologies. I just need honesty. From both of you." Melissa nodded, voice trembling. "I told you everything already. I never meant for it to go that far. It started small. Richard came over one evening when you were away visiting your mother. He said he needed to talk. One thing led to another, and I didn't stop it. I should have." Richard's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Melissa continued, her voice breaking. "It wasn't love. It was confusion, and guilt followed me every day. That's why I came to you. Not to destroy your marriage, but because I couldn't live with the lie anymore." Laura listened quietly. She didn't interrupt or cry this time. She just absorbed every word. When Melissa finished, Laura turned to Richard. "Do you love her?" Richard blinked, clearly unprepared for the question. "No," he said quickly. "It wasn't about love. It was a mistake, and I regret it." "Then what was it about?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The silence spoke louder than any excuse. Laura stood up slowly, pushing her chair back. "You know what hurts the most, Richard? It's not that you cheated. It's that you looked me in the eyes every day and pretended you hadn't. You made me doubt myself instead of your lies." Richard looked down, ashamed. "I didn't want to lose you." "You already did," she said softly. Melissa wiped her tears, whispering, "Laura, I'll leave now. I don't want to make things worse." But Laura stopped her again. "You don't have to leave yet. You told me the truth. That's more than he ever did. And maybe I need someone else who's been hurt by him to help me understand what to do next." For a moment, Richard looked stunned. "You're choosing her over me." Laura looked him straight in the eyes. "I'm choosing honesty over lies." The words hung in the air like a final verdict. Richard had no defense left. He grabbed his coat and walked out, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the house, but Laura felt strangely lighter. Melissa sat quietly, unsure what to say. "I didn't expect you to be this calm," she whispered. Laura gave a faint smile. "I've cried enough in silence. Now I just want peace." They spent the rest of the morning in quiet conversation. Melissa shared how Richard had made her believe he was lonely and misunderstood, how he'd spoken softly about Laura being too focused on her work, how he'd painted himself as the victim. Listening to it, Laura realized how well he had played both sides, pretending to be the devoted husband at home while seeking sympathy elsewhere by noon. Laura felt clarity instead of confusion. She understood that Richard's actions weren't about her not being enough, They were about his own emptiness. That realization didn't erase the pain, but it gave her strength when Melissa finally stood to leave. Laura walked her to the door. "Whatever happens next," she said gently, "don't carry this guilt forever. You made a mistake, but you also had the courage to admit it." Melissa nodded, tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Laura. I don't deserve your kindness, but I'll never forget it." After Melissa left, the house felt unusually quiet. Laura walked through each room, seeing traces of the life she once thought was perfect. Framed photos, vacations, souvenirs, love letters tucked in drawers. All pieces of a story that now felt like fiction. She picked up one photo, their wedding picture, and stared at the smiles frozen in time. They looked like two strangers now, as the afternoon sun filtered through the curtains. Laura sat by the window and took a deep breath. She wasn't broken. She was free. The truth had hurt, but it had also given her something new, a reason to start over. Later that evening, Richard returned. He didn't knock or call first. He simply walked in looking tired and lost. "Laura, can we talk?" She looked at him calmly. "About what?" "About us. About fixing this. Fixing." She repeated quietly. "You can't fix something you never respected." He stepped closer, desperate. "I made a terrible mistake. I was weak. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm asking for another chance." Laura stood up and faced him. "Richard, I don't hate you, but I don't trust you either. And without trust, there's nothing left to rebuild." He nodded slowly, eyes filled with regret. "So, this is it?" "Yes," she said firmly. "This is it." He looked around the house, their home, one last time. "I'll pack my things tomorrow." "You should," she said softly. "And I hope you find whatever it is you've been searching for." Richard left quietly this time, closing the door behind him. Laura watched him go without tears. There was pain, yes, but also relief. The kind that comes when a wound is finally cleaned instead of covered. That night, Laura sat alone under the soft glow of a lamp. She opened her journal and began to write, not about betrayal, but about strength. She wrote how sometimes people break not because they are weak, but because they've carried too much for too long. She wrote about forgiveness, not the kind given to others, but the kind you give yourself when you decide to let go. Days passed, and the neighborhood soon buzzed with quiet whispers about what had happened. But Laura didn't care. She went on morning walks, cooked for herself, and learned to enjoy her own company again. Melissa moved away not long after, leaving a note that simply said, "Thank you for treating me like a human, even when I didn't deserve it." Months later, Laura found herself standing by the same window where it had all begun. The one where she had waited for Richard so many nights. This time she wasn't waiting for anyone. She smiled softly to herself, knowing that healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant learning to live again. Wiser and stronger, she whispered to the empty room. "Sometimes, the storm you fear the most clears the path you were meant to walk." Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, bright and warm. And for the first time in a long while, Laura felt free. Months had passed since Richard left, and Laura had built a quiet rhythm around her solitude. The house, once filled with tension and unspoken emotions, now felt peaceful. She woke up early, brewed her coffee, and opened the windows to let the morning breeze in. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was hers again. She had learned to enjoy silence without feeling lonely. Still, there were moments when memories returned, like old ghosts, the laughter she once shared with Richard, the holidays spent together, and the dreams they had planned. They didn't hurt as much now, but they lingered, reminding her of everything she had lost and everything she had learned. One evening, Laura was watering the small plants on her porch when she saw a car she hadn't seen in months pull up across the street. It was Richard's. Her heart skipped, not from love or anger, but from the sudden reminder that some chapters, no matter how closed, have a way of knocking one last time. He stepped out, looking thinner, older. His expression carried both nervousness and humility. Laura didn't move. She simply waited, watching as he approached. "Hi, Laura," he said quietly. "Hi." Richard, she replied, her voice steady but distant. I didn't mean to surprise you. I was driving through town and I guess I just wanted to see how you're doing. Laura nodded. I'm fine. Better than before. He smiled faintly. You look better. Peace suits you. There was a pause long enough for both of them to feel the weight of everything left unsaid. Richard finally spoke again. I've been going to therapy, trying to understand why I did what I did. I know I can't undo it, but I wanted you to know that I'm not the same man anymore. Oh. Laura looked at him carefully. His eyes held sincerity, maybe even regret. But she had learned that regret didn't always mean change. That's good, Richard, she said softly. I'm glad you're getting help. I also wanted to say thank you, he continued, for not destroying me when you could have. You had every right to, but you didn't. You just let me go. Laura gave a small, knowing smile. Letting go was the hardest thing I've ever done, but holding on to anger would have hurt me more. He nodded slowly, looking at the ground. Do you ever think about us? She hesitated. Sometimes, but not in the way you think. I remember us as a story that had its time. It wasn't all bad, Richard. We had good years before everything changed. Richard exhaled deeply. I still miss those years. Laura didn't reply. Instead, she stepped aside and gestured toward the porch chairs. You can sit for a while if you want. It's a nice evening. Key smiled gratefully. They sat side by side just like they used to, but the air between them was different, calm, not charged. The sunset painted the sky in soft golds and pinks, and for a while neither of them spoke. Finally, Richard broke the silence. Do you ever think you could forgive me? Laura turned to him. I already did, she said. Not for you, but for me. Forgiveness isn't about pretending it didn't happen. It's about refusing to let it control what happens next. Her words hit him deeply. He nodded, eyes glistening. You always had more strength than me. It's not strength, she said quietly. It's survival. They talked for a little longer about their grown-up kids, mutual friends, the changes in the neighborhood. It was almost surreal to people who had once shared everything, now sitting as polite acquaintances. When he finally stood to leave, Richard looked back at her with a mix of sadness and peace. You deserve happiness, Laura. I hope you find it. She smiled. I already have, Richard. It just looks different now. When he drove away, Laura didn't cry. Instead, she looked up at the fading sunlight and whispered to herself, that chapter is truly over. Weeks later, life surprised her again, not with pain this time, but with something new. A new neighbor moved into the house next door. A retired art teacher named Paul. He was kind, soft-spoken, and carried an easy smile that reminded Laura of calmer days. They met one afternoon when she found him struggling to carry a box of books from his car. Need a hand? Laura asked. He chuckled. That obvious, huh? They laughed, and something about his warmth disarmed her. Over the next few weeks, they often ran into each other at the mailbox, on morning walks, or while tending to their gardens. Conversations grew longer, smiles came easier, and soon enough, friendship felt natural. One evening, Paul invited her for coffee at his place. His living room was cozy, filled with art pieces he had painted over the years, soft landscapes, quiet streets, portraits that carried emotion. Laura was fascinated. These are beautiful, she said, walking around the room. Paul smiled modestly. They're memories. I paint what I miss. What do you miss most? She asked gently. He looked thoughtful. Connection. Not romance, necessarily, just the comfort of being seen by someone who understands. Laura's heart ached a little at that. I know what you mean, she said softly. From that night on, they spent more time together, sharing dinners, watching movies, sometimes just talking for hours about life. There was no rush, no expectation. It was simple and honest to people learning to trust the quiet again. One rainy evening, as they sat on Laura's porch watching the drizzle, Paul turned to her and said, you smile differently now than when I first met you. She laughed lightly. Oh, how's that? It reaches your eyes now, he said. Laura looked at him. And for the first time in a long while, she felt a flutter in her chest, not the sharp sting of heartbreak, but the gentle warmth of possibility. She didn't need to label it. It was enough to simply feel alive again. Months rolled by and life slowly took on new meaning. Laura joined an art class that Paul taught at the local community center. Painting became her new therapy. Through every brush stroke, she expressed feelings she could never put into words: the ache of betrayal, the peace of forgiveness, the joy of rediscovery. Her favorite painting was a sunrise, bright, warm, and endless. She titled it "The Beginning After the End." When Paul saw it, he smiled. "You've come full circle," he said softly. Laura nodded. "I think I finally understand that endings aren't failures. Sometimes they're invitations to start again." Later that evening, as they walked home together, Laura glanced at the stars above. "You ever wonder if things happen for a reason?" Paul shrugged with a gentle smile. "Maybe not for a reason, but definitely for a lesson." Laura laughed softly. "Then I've learned plenty." "Me too," he said. They reached her porch where the light glowed softly. Paul hesitated for a moment, then said, "I'm glad I moved here. I'm glad you did too." Laura replied with a warm smile as he walked away. She watched him disappear into the gentle night. Her heart felt light, not from romance alone, but from peace. She had survived the storm, faced her truth, and allowed herself to heal. And now she was ready for whatever life still had to offer that night. She wrote one final entry in her journal. "Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it rewrites the future. I thought losing love meant losing life, but maybe it was the beginning of finding myself. Some doors close so better ones can open. Today I finally walked through mine." Laura closed the journal, smiled softly, and turned off the light. The past no longer haunted her. It guided her. She was no longer someone's wife, no longer someone's victim. She was simply Laura, a woman who had learned how to love again, starting with herself and outside. The wind carried the faintest whisper of peace through the quiet neighborhood, as if the world itself was saying, "You made it." The first time Ethan met Claire was one of those moments that seemed too ordinary to ever matter, but ended up changing everything. It was early spring in Seattle, the kind of day when the rain didn't fall, but hung in the air like a secret waiting to be told. Ethan had just moved into a small apartment building on the north end of town. He was 35, an architect who had recently gone through a quiet breakup. His days were predictable: work, gym, dinner, sleep. He liked it that way. Predictable meant safe. Claire was his upstairs neighbor. He met her by accident when she dropped a grocery bag in the hallway. Apples rolled across the floor, and when Ethan bent down to help, she laughed softly. "Guess I bought more than I could carry," she said. Her voice had warmth in it, like a song that played in the background of your mind even after it ended. She looked to be in her early 30s, light brown hair, green eyes that seemed to read more than they should. Ethan noticed her wedding ring almost immediately. Her husband, she mentioned casually, worked nights as a long-haul driver. "He's away a lot," she said with a small shrug. Ethan nodded, unsure what to say. In the weeks that followed, they crossed paths often. Sometimes in the hallway, sometimes in the parking lot, sometimes at the coffee shop down the street. Claire had a way of making conversation feel natural, effortless. She'd ask him about his work, his favorite books, the view from his balcony. Ethan found himself looking forward to these moments, though he didn't quite understand why. One afternoon, Ski knocked on his door. "Hey," she said, holding up a set of car keys. "My husband's truck broke down at the service station across town. I have to drive him there to pick it up, but I'm terrible with directions. Want to come along?" Ethan hesitated. It was Saturday. He had plans to review blueprints. But something about the way she smiled, half hopeful, half playful, made him nod. "Sure," he said. "Why not?" The ride started off lighthearted. Claire talked about everything from her job at the local school to her love for old music. Ethan listened, laughing at her jokes, surprised by how easily the two of them connected. When they reached the service station, her husband, Jack, was already waiting. He was older than Ethan had imagined, tough-looking with the kind of face that told stories without words. He shook Ethan's hand firmly. Appreciate you coming along, man, said. They drove back together, Claire in the passenger seat, Ethan in the back, and Jack behind the wheel. Rain started to drizzle again, the wipers moving in slow, steady arcs. The air inside the car felt oddly heavy. Jack was quiet, focused on the road. Claire kept turning slightly toward Ethan, her voice soft whenever she spoke. At one point, she looked out the window and said, "Do you ever get the feeling life just slips away? Like you're watching it instead of living it?" Ethan met her eyes in the rearview mirror. "Yeah," he said, "all the time." Jack chuckled from the front seat, though it wasn't a laugh that carried joy. "You're both too young to be thinking like that," he said. But Claire didn't answer, and for the rest of the ride, silence filled the space between the three of them like fog. Later that evening, when Ethan got back to his apartment, he couldn't stop thinking about her words or the way she looked at him when she said them. There was something in her eyes that felt familiar, loneliness maybe, or quiet longing. He told himself not to read into it. She was married, and whatever she felt, it wasn't his place to notice. A few days passed before he saw her again. It was raining harder this time, the kind of Seattle rain that soaked you even with an umbrella. She was standing outside, struggling with her car's trunk. "Won't close," she said when he walked over. He helped her press it down until it latched, and she smiled gratefully. "You're my hero today." Ethan tried to brush off the warmth that spread through him. "Glad I could help." She hesitated for a second, then said, "You want to grab a coffee? I think I owe you one for the trunk." They went to a quiet cafe near the corner. The smell of roasted beans and rain filled the air. They talked for hours about books, movies, childhood memories. Claire mentioned she used to paint but hadn't touched a brush in years. "Jack doesn't really get it," she said softly. "He's practical. Art isn't practical." Ethan looked at her thoughtfully. "Maybe not, but it's necessary." She smiled faintly, her eyes softening. "Yeah, maybe it is." From that day on, their friendship deepened. They texted sometimes short, harmless messages. They bumped into each other often enough that it almost felt intentional. Ethan began to feel the pull between them grow stronger, though he tried to ignore it. There were moments when her gaze lingered a little too long, or her voice softened just a bit when she said his name. But she always pulled back first. One Sunday morning, Claire knocked on his door again. "I need a favor," she said. "Jack's truck broke down again, and I have to drive him to pick it up same place as before. Want to come?" Ethan hesitated but nodded. Something about her request felt like déjà vu. The three of them were in the car once more, Jack driving, Claire in the passenger seat, Ethan behind her. The road stretched long and gray ahead of them, the rain falling harder now. Jack turned on the radio. A slow old song filled the space. Claire leaned her head against the window, her fingers tracing small circles on the glass. Halfway through the trip, Jack asked, "So, Ethan, you seeing anyone these days?" Ethan smiled awkwardly. "Not really. Been focusing on work." Jack laughed. "Smart man. Women'll drive you crazy if you let them." Claire didn't laugh. She turned slightly. Looking back at Ethan, there was something unspoken, in her eyes a quiet ache, that made his chest tighten. When they reached the service station, Jack went inside to handle paperwork. Claire stayed in the car. The rain drummed against the roof, steady and rhythmic. She turned to him and said quietly, "You know, sometimes I wonder what it's like to be really seen. Not as someone's wife or neighbor, but as yourself." Ethan's heart pounded. "You deserve that," he said simply. For a long moment, she didn't respond. Then she smiled, sad and beautiful. "You're kind, Ethan. Maybe too kind." Kay returned soon after, breaking the spell. They drove back in near silence. But from that day on, nothing felt the same. Every glance, every word between Ethan and Claire carried a weight neither of them dared to name. Ethan tried to distance himself. He buried himself in work, avoided the hallway, ignored her texts. But every time he heard footsteps above him, he thought of her. Every night when the rain tapped at his window, he imagined her doing the same awake, wondering what might have been. Weeks later, she showed up at his door one last time. She looked different, tired, eyes a little red, hands trembling slightly. "We're moving," she said quietly. Jack got a new job out of state. Ethan's stomach dropped. He nodded, unsure what to say. I'll miss you, he finally whispered. Claire smiled faintly. I'll miss you too. She handed him a small wrapped canvas. I painted this last week, she said. It's not much, but it's something. After she left, Ethan unwrapped it. It was a painting of rain falling over their apartment building, the windows glowing softly through the storm. At the bottom corner, in small, almost hidden letters, she had written, "For when the ride ends, but the memory doesn't." And for Ethan, it never did. Months passed after Claire's departure, and Ethan tried to convince himself life had gone back to normal. But normal wasn't the same anymore. He had changed in quiet ways he couldn't explain. The rain outside his apartment no longer felt peaceful. It sounded like a memory knocking on his window. Every place in town reminded him of her, the coffee shop, the parking lot, even the hallway where she'd once dropped her groceries. He buried himself in work. The architectural firm where he worked had taken on a new project, community library near the lake. It was supposed to be a fresh start for him, something to keep his hands and mind occupied. Yet sometimes, while sketching designs, his mind drifted back to the woman who once talked about feeling unseen. He wondered if she ever started painting again, or if she packed away her brushes when she left. It was a late evening in November when everything changed again. The rain was falling hard and Ethan had stayed late at the office. His phone buzzed a number he didn't recognize. He almost ignored it, but something made him answer. Ethan. The voice on the other end was soft, uncertain. But he knew it immediately. Claire. He stood up, his heart thudding. Is that really you? She laughed nervously. Yeah, I didn't think you'd remember. He could almost hear her smile through the phone. I could never forget, he said quietly. She explained that she was back in Seattle temporarily. Jack had taken a contract job in Alaska, and she'd decided to visit her sister who still lived in town. I was driving past the old building, she said, and I thought of you. Thought I'd call. Ethan hesitated before saying, Do you want to meet for coffee? There was a pause, then a soft, I'd like that. They met the next afternoon at the same cafe they'd once visited. When Ethan walked in, his breath caught. Claire looked a little older, but in a graceful way. Her hair was shorter, and her eyes held that same quiet depth he remembered. She smiled when she saw him, and for a moment, it felt like the months apart had never happened. You look well, he said as they sat down. So do you, she replied, stirring her coffee. Still working too hard, I bet? He smiled faintly. Guilty. They talked for hours again, like before. Claire told him she'd started painting again while living out of state. It kept me sane, she admitted. Some days, it was the only thing that made me feel alive. Ethan felt something shift inside him. He could see that spark again, the one that used to live beneath her quiet sadness. When she described the colors she used, her eyes lit up in a way that pulled him in completely. But there was something else, too, something unspoken. Hovering between them, a weight they both felt but didn't name. After coffee, they walked outside. The rain had eased, turning into a soft drizzle. Claire tilted her face up to the sky and smiled. It feels like the city never stopped raining, she said. Ethan looked at her and replied, Maybe it never does. Maybe we just forget how to notice it. They walked along the street, side by side, talking about everything and nothing. When they reached her car, she hesitated. Would you like to come by my sister's place sometime? I've got a few of my new paintings there. He nodded. I'd love to. A few days later, he did. Her sister's house was cozy, filled with plants and the smell of cinnamon. Claire led him into a small room where her paintings were displayed. They were stunning landscapes, faces, moments frozen in color. One of them stopped him completely. It was of a man standing under an umbrella in the rain, looking up at a lit window. That one's called The Wait, she said softly. He turned toward her. It's beautiful. Their eyes met, and for a second, neither looked away. The air between them grew still. Then Claire blinked, breaking the moment. I didn't mean to make things awkward, she said. Ethan smiled gently. You didn't. It's just a powerful painting. They spent the afternoon talking about art and life. But as the sky darkened, Ethan knew he should leave. At the door, Claire looked at him, her voice quiet. You know, I missed having someone who listens like you do. He wanted to say he'd missed everything about her, but instead he nodded. I'm glad you called. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. The memory of her face, her voice, the rain, all of it played in his mind like an unfinished song. He knew what he felt, but he also knew the boundaries that still existed. Claire was still married, even if her husband was far away. The next time they met, it was by accident, or maybe not. Ethan was shopping for groceries when he saw her by the fruit section, holding a bag of apples. She laughed when she noticed him. Seems like this is how we always meet, she said, remembering their first encounter years ago. Guess fate has a sense of humor, he replied. They ended up grabbing lunch nearby. As they ate, she talked more openly about her life. Jack's changed, she said quietly. He's distant. We barely talk anymore. I think he's happier being away. Ethan listened, his chest tightening. I'm sorry, he said softly. She shook her head. Don't be. It's not your fault. It's just life, I guess. They sat in silence for a while, both lost in thought. Then Claire said something that made his heart race. Sometimes I wonder if we met at the wrong time. Ethan looked at her, his pulse quickening. Maybe, he said, but sometimes even the wrong time feels right. Their eyes held for a moment too long. Then she smiled sadly. You always know what to say. After that day, they began seeing each other more often, always in public, always careful. But the closeness between them grew stronger. There was something pure about it, yet undeniably charged with emotion. They'd walk along the waterfront, talking about art, books, and dreams they'd never chased. One evening, they sat on a bench overlooking the lake. The city lights shimmered across the water, and the air smelled of rain. Claire sighed. I forgot how peaceful this feels, she said. Back home, everything is just noise. Ethan turned toward her. Maybe that's why you came back to remember what peace feels like. She smiled faintly. Maybe I did. For a long time, neither spoke. Then she whispered, You ever think about what could have been? Ethan swallowed hard. All the time. Their eyes met, and in that instant, everything they'd tried to suppress came rushing to the surface, the longing. The connection, the quiet ache that had never gone away. But instead of acting on it, Claire stood and looked at the water. We can't, Ethan, she said softly. Not like this. He nodded slowly. I know. She smiled through the sadness. You always do. Before leaving, she placed something in his hand, a small folded note. Don't read it now, she said. Wait until I'm gone. That night, he sat on his balcony and opened it. Her handwriting was delicate, the ink slightly smudged by rain. It read, You once said life slips away when we stop living it. You were right. I just don't know how to start living again without hurting someone else. Thank you for reminding me what it feels like to be seen. Ethan read it again and again, his heart aching in silence. He didn't call her, didn't text. Maybe he was afraid she'd already gone back to her husband, or maybe he knew that was how it had to be. A week later, he visited the cafe alone. The same corner table where they used to sit now stood empty. He ordered her usual drink, black coffee with a hint of cinnamon, and left it untouched. As he walked out into the rain, he looked up at the gray sky and whispered, Goodbye, Claire. He didn't see her again for months, but her note stayed with him, tucked inside the cover of his sketchbook. Whenever the rain fell, he'd think of her, how she brought color into his gray world, even if only for a moment. Winter came to Seattle, wrapping the city in fog and quiet. Ethan's days moved in slow motion, work, sleep, rain, repeat. He told himself he was fine, that the ache had faded with time. But sometimes, when the rain hit the window just right, it all came back, her voice, her laughter. The warmth that once sat across from him in that corner cafe, it had been nearly a year since he'd last seen Claire. Her note was still tucked inside his sketchbook, its edges worn from being read too many times. He had thrown himself into his projects, earning promotions, leading teams, but none of it filled the quiet space she'd left behind. Then, one evening, as he walked home from work, he saw a familiar painting displayed in a small art gallery window. His heart stopped. It was the same piece she'd shown him long ago. Beneath it, a small tag read, "By Claire Turner." Stepped inside, his pulse quickening. The gallery was softly lit, filled with the scent of old wood and varnish. People were moving slowly between the pieces, murmuring about colors and brushwork. Ethan scanned the room, hoping and fearing to see her. Then he did. Claire stood near the back of the room, speaking to an older woman. She looked radiant, confident, composed, her hair loosely tied back. When her eyes lifted and met his, she froze. The conversation around her faded, and for a heartbeat, neither moved. Then she smiled, small, hesitant, but real. "Ethan," Jay said when he approached, her voice softer than he remembered. "I wasn't sure if I should come in," C smiling faintly. "But then I saw the weight." She glanced toward the painting and laughed lightly. "That one. It's always been close to my heart." "I can see why," he replied. "It's incredible." They stood there for a long moment, surrounded by quiet admiration and half-heard whispers. The air felt charged, yet calm, like the pause between thunder and rain. After the event, she invited him for coffee nearby. It felt strangely familiar, walking beside her again through the drizzle. She'd moved back to Seattle permanently, she explained. Jack had accepted a long-term position in Anchorage, and they decided to live separately for a while to figure out who we really are, she said. "And who are you?" Ethan asked gently. Claire smiled, her eyes distant. "Someone's still learning?" At the cafe, they spoke like old friends who had never truly drifted apart. She told him about her new art studio downtown, about teaching painting to children on weekends, and about rediscovering her own strength. Ethan listened, admiring the quiet glow in her voice. Then she said something that made him pause. "You know, for a long time, I kept wondering what might have happened if I'd stayed." He looked up. "Stayed where?" "In that moment," she said softly. "When I gave you that note, I almost turned back that night. I almost knocked on your door." Ethan's breath caught. "Why didn't you?" She sighed. "Because I was scared that I'd ruin everything. That maybe what I felt was just loneliness." He studied her face. "And now? Do you still think it was loneliness?" She smiled faintly. "No, I think it was something real. But sometimes real things come at the wrong time." They fell into silence again. The cafe's warm light flickered across their faces, and outside the rain began to fall harder. Claire looked out the window, then back at him. "I didn't plan on running into you tonight," she said. "Maybe it wasn't planned," Ethan replied. "Maybe it was time catching up." She laughed quietly. "You always find a way to make things sound poetic." When they left the cafe, the city glowed under streetlights reflected in puddles. Claire pulled her coat tighter. "Would you like to see my studio?" she asked. "It's close." Ethan nodded, and they walked together through the damp streets. Her studio was small but beautiful, paint-stained floors, sketches pinned to the walls, brushes lined up like instruments waiting to play. He looked around, genuinely impressed. "You built this," he said softly. "From nothing?" She smiled. "It's home now." There was a canvas on the easel, half finished, a man standing under soft light, his face turned away. Ethan stared at it for a moment. "That looks familiar," he murmured. Claire laughed gently. "It's no one specific." He raised an eyebrow. "Sure." They shared a long look, one that said everything neither dared to put into words. Then she turned back to her canvas and said quietly, "You know, I never thanked you." "For what?" "For reminding me that I was still worth seeing." He swallowed hard. "You did that on your own, Claire?" She smiled sadly. "Maybe, but you helped me believe it." The next few weeks passed in quiet rhythm. They saw each other often, coffee on Saturdays, walks through the market, sometimes long talks in her studio while she painted. Their connection deepened again, but this time it felt gentler. There was no rush, no guilt, Only the kind of warmth that comes from two souls who finally stopped pretending. Yet, underneath the calm, Ethan sensed a hesitation in her. One afternoon, as they watched the rain fall outside her studio window, he asked Claire, "What happens now?" She looked down at her hands, then back at him. "I don't know," she admitted. "Jack and I haven't spoken much, but I need to finish that chapter before I start another." He nodded slowly. "That's fair." She reached across the table and took his hand. "I don't want to hurt anyone again, but I don't want to lose something real either." He squeezed her hand gently. "Then don't. Just be honest with him and with yourself." The next week, she told him she'd decided to fly to Anchorage to talk to Jack face to face, to end things the right way. Ethan's heart ached at the thought, but he respected it. Before leaving, she came to see him one last time. They stood by the lake where they used to walk, the air crisp and still. "I don't know what's going to happen," she said quietly. "But whatever it is, thank you for being the one person who never made me feel small." He smiled through the ache. "Just promise me one thing," he said. "Don't disappear this time." She nodded, eyes glistening. "I won't." He left the next morning. Weeks passed. Ethan heard nothing. He tried not to think about it, but every evening he found himself looking at his phone, half hoping for her name to appear. Then, one afternoon, he got a message. "I'm back." They met at the lake again. This time Claire looked peaceful. "It's over," she said softly. "We both knew it was time. We parted kindly." Ethan studied her face. "And now?" She smiled. "Now I want to start painting new things. Things that don't come from pain anymore." He reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. They stood there quietly, the rain beginning to fall, soft and steady. "You know," she said, with a hint of laughter, "I used to hate the rain. But now, every time it falls, I think of you." Ethan smiled. Maybe the rain was always our way of finding each other. They walked together down the path, hands intertwined, their steps slow and certain. The storm that had once separated them had finally passed, for the first time in a long while. Ethan felt like he was no longer waiting. He was living. And as they disappeared into the mist, Seattle's rain fell gently around them, washing away the years of what-ifs and maybes, leaving only something quiet, real and new. That night back in her studio, Claire began a new painting. The title she wrote in small letters at the bottom read, "When the Heart Finally Spoke." And for the first time, both of them knew it wasn't the end of something broken, it was the beginning of something true.